While the U.S. and China slug it out with their trade war, thousands of miles away, the impact is being felt in Europe, especially when it comes to access to critical minerals. Europe's dual dependence on America's digital services and Beijing's critical mineral industry has left it highly vulnerable. So, how can Europe secure its place in the global race for critical minerals? And for that, joining us in the studio is Matej Šimalčík, Executive Director of the Central European Institute of Asian Studies in Taipei. Thank you very much for being with us in the studio, Matej.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me.
Right, so this is we've talked about critical minerals from many different locations, but this is the first time we're actually talking about it from the European perspective. So I'm really interested to find out, one, Europe's deficiencies, and two, what they're doing about it. But before I do that, can you just tell us how much Europe actually produces of the critical minerals it needs for its defense and landmark industries at the moment?
Yeah, so currently it's actually a very minimal amount, and it leads to this problem that Europe currently has, that the supplies of critical minerals that its industries need, especially strategic industries like defense, semiconductor, automotive, a lot of this has to be sourced externally, right? And there is essentially almost a full dependence on outside EU sources of these resources for European industry. The dependency has many faces, right? One part of that is the lack of production of the ores within Europe, but also lack of processing capacity, which is a key milestone in the production cycle for any of the goods that require critical minerals in their production, right? Currently, we know that large portions of the ore production, around 80% globally is dependent on China. Even more importantly, 90% of the processing capacity is dependent on China, right? Which causes a lot of issues for European industry, especially right now when China has issued full-fledged export control regime for critical minerals, and it subjects all exports to licensing requirements, and essentially doesn't want to supply critical minerals that would be used in the production of defense equipment and weapons, right? So this is a big problem right now for Europe as it is trying to rearm, but also for the other sectors, right? EU is pushing for establishing more capacity for semiconductor production, for example. That's also dependent on sourcing of critical minerals like gallium.
All right, so before we go into the individual or break it down as to which sectors really are very vulnerable at the moment, I want to ask you, so you mentioned China's export controls. And I understand a lot of that is the collateral from the US-China trade war. But is there any other way that Europe is, I guess, vulnerable or exposed in the context of the US-China trade war?
Yeah, so the critical minerals is a key thing in this war, but of course there are other dependencies that Europe has vis-a-vis China that could be potentially exploited. I think it's also important to recognize that EU is also an actor in its own rights, right? And not everything that is happening to Europe in the relationship with China is merely an extension of the US-China trade war, right? Europe has its own grievances with China as well, and that's also one of the reason why it is getting caught in the conflict with China. When we would look at the list of dependencies that emerge when you are looking at the European industry and the dependence on China, the other major thing would be, for example, pharmaceuticals and active pharmaceutical components, which is also something that could be easily exploited by China. But there's also dependencies going the other way around, right? And Europe needs to take stock of them and figure out whether it wants to use them as a bargaining chip as well, and as a tool, one of the tools in the economic security toolkit. The key one being, for example, China's dependence on sourcing semiconductor lithography equipment out of Europe.
Yeah, and give us a bit of context on why Europe can use that as a bargaining chip.
It's something that the EU really has to think about whether it wants to use it or not, right? On one hand, there are already some restrictions, right, in place for the lithography machines, with the hope that it will slow down China's development of.
And again, that directive comes from the US, though.
It's a part of the package of deals and discussions between EU and especially the specific member states, like Netherlands in this case, and the US, right? But this is, I think, something we need to recognize also, that actually when it comes to understanding Europe's position on China and the risks it sees in China, a lot of that is actually aligned with the US, right? What sometimes is not aligned is the tools and the approach, right? And of course, there is the separate issue of ongoing trade grievances between the US and EU, which is putting this whole EU-China relationship in a little bit of a different perspective as well.
All right, and if we go to one of the sensitive industries in both the US and the EU, particularly in the EU at the moment, it's the defense sector. What impact has or is China's critical mineral controls having on that sector, and how concerned is the EU about that?
This is a big concern, right? When it comes to some of the critical minerals and products made from them that are sourced from China, one key thing would be high efficiency magnets, for example, which is a crucial component in the production of machinery, which means also a lot of the weapon systems that need to be produced, but also other parts of European economy, like the automotive industry, especially when it would come to the production of electric vehicles, which puts multiple pressures on European economy, not just on the production of weapons and military systems, but also on the automotive sector as a backbone of European economy. So this is a really multifaceted problem for the EU. EU has been recognizing that it has a problem with the dependency on sourcing critical raw materials, and it is trying to respond to that. Last year, the so-called Critical Minerals Act has come into effect, and that is actually obliging EU to meet certain benchmarks by 2030, namely making sure that at least 10% of critical minerals are mined in Europe from the whole 100% that Europe needs, that 40% at least would be processed in Europe, 25% should come from recycling of existing components, so there's also this sort of environmental element to that, and also making sure that in any case for any one of those critical materials, Europe would not have a single source dependency higher than 65%, right?
Right. So you talked about Brussels' strategy here, and then they have come up with a strategic plan this year. But that is facing opposition from many environmental groups and becoming a political hot-button issue also. Can you give us a sense of whether Brussels can overcome those issues and what it's going to take to reach the targets it's setting that you've just spoken about?
Yeah, so this is one of the typical problems that we often see in Europe in this discussion. Some people wanting to have the cake and eat it too. It is certainly a dilemma to what extent we want to achieve strategic autonomy and reduce our dependence while sacrificing some of the environmental goals and values, right, which have been long-term an aspect in European governance, right? There is certainly an issue when it comes to approvals of new mining sites, that these face a lot of local opposition, either from the inhabitants of the locations or from environmental groups. To overcome this, the one part of the proposal is to reduce licensing requirements for operation of new mining sites, right? Overall, nowadays we see push from the European Commission to reduce bureaucratic burdens, not just for this sector, but overall for the European economy. One part of that is, of course, necessary for achieving these goals when it comes to production of critical minerals. But this is also something that's important for the EU economy as a whole. The Draghi report published last year has really showed that a lot of the bureaucratic burdens and red tape and over-regulation is costing a high percentage of potential European GDP. And as of this month, we see that the European Commission is going to be tackling this problem more holistically as well. But yeah, specifically when it comes to the mining, there is attempts to also allow some of the projects to be labeled as, let's say, critical investments, investments of high importance, which would reduce some of the bureaucratic burdens that come with approvals. One part of that is also introducing time limits on how long approval procedures should take place, so that these projects are not hanging in the limbo for too long, and which would, of course, endanger this goal that EU wants to achieve by 2030.
Another issue that could throw a spanner in Europe trying to set up or establish its own critical minerals industry is cost. China can currently produce, mine, give you that finished product 30% less at 30% less cost than anyone else can do it, because they've got the economies of scale and they're established. So is there much talk of subsidizing the production of critical minerals at the moment? As what would happen if they don't is you're going to see other costs rise for the products it's being used in.
Yeah, I think that without effective subsidization policy, this will be very difficult to achieve. As you said, China currently has economies of scale which Europe lacks. And in order to be able to achieve the same position, right, EU needs to invest in this sector. This investment will not come purely out of private sector, because from a pure market perspective and a short-term economic logic, it would not pay off, right? But there is a long-term reasoning that EU needs to also take into account, which it means that if we want to stick with this goal of reducing dependence on China or any other source of critical minerals, then we need to pay up, right? And in order to be able to achieve the sufficient capacities, both in terms of mining, but also in terms of processing. Already we see that EU has approved some of the projects, both within the EU, but also outside EU, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America. It's also a big part of ongoing free trade negotiations with non-European partners. It's a big component of the negotiations for a free trade agreement with Indonesia, for example, which is one of the key global suppliers of nickel, for example, right? So it is a multifaceted approach, right? But subsidization is certainly going to be an important part of how Europe can achieve this.
And which parts of Europe are currently looking at building these industries?
So we already know that the projects are approved, for example, in Portugal, in Spain, in Italy, in many European countries, right? Despite the name of some of these critical minerals as rare earths, they are actually not so geologically rare, right? The issue is that they are found in usually very not high concentrations, right, in the nature. So you need to be able to find out which locations are suitable for mining. But there's locations suitable for mining all over Europe, right? But as we already said, a lot of the proposals face local backlash. So even if we are able to find these locations, of which certainly there are numerous across the EU, the concerned governments will need to deal with this local opposition, so that the citizens understand that this is something that's very necessary for Europe's continued economic well-being, but also to take their concerns seriously and come up with sufficient alleviation tools, right, so that the concerns are minimized.
And finally, as someone who is watching Asia closely from Taipei, how should Europe rethink its approach to China and maybe even building mutual processing cooperations with Taiwan? Is there any movement in that direction? Or if there isn't, what would your advice be?
Right. So Europe's approach to China has been since 2019 based on this trifecta that it simultaneously sees China as a partner, competitor, and a systemic rival, right? And when it comes to economic dependencies and China's increased willingness to weaponize them against Europe, certainly the competitor and rival part of the trifecta comes to the fore. What Europe needs, of course, is to establish more partnerships with like-minded partners outside of China, right? So that it can secure the necessary production capacities for critical minerals. Europe will very likely not be able to do that alone. And partnerships with countries, especially countries in the global south, is going to be a key component of that, right? Of course, there's potential also to partner with various Indo-Pacific states, including Taiwan, so that the supply needs of all of the Europe's partners are taken into account.